Hi everyone, welcome to Intro to React. I'll be going over some of the fundamentals of React today as they pertain to React Native. I wish I could teach you a little bit more, but seeing that we have only a week, I'm just going to give you what you need to know in order to work with the tools next week. And so the link to the slides and the link to the GitHub repo will be posted in our Discord, and they will also be available in the description down below. A little bit about what we're going to go over today. We're going to look at the goal and our tech stack, creating a boilerplate for React web applications, and then some of the concepts for today, and then also a live demo of the app we're building. All right. So the goal of today is going to be to create a basic web application and understand the React framework. Product is going to be a chat room application. So our tech stack is essentially the React framework. And so what we're going to be doing is, to understand some of these concepts, is just going through some examples that are just pieces of code, and I'll walk you through those. But for now, what you need to know is we use React just because it's good for managing states, and the use of components are very helpful in not repeating yourself and being reusable. All right. So before I even go over this, you're going to need to install node.js, which is essentially a package manager that you'll need. But once you have that installed, you can go ahead and create a React app by using the command npx create React app. And then the name of your app, here it's my app, and that will create a boilerplate for you. And then you can move into it, and then you can get it up and running by typing npm start, and that will start up a local host for you. How we're going to do it might be a little bit different just because we have starter code available for you. But essentially, if you wanted to create a new React application, this is one of the ways that you could do it. All right, let's get into some of the concepts. So what is JSX? So for those who have just learned last week, or maybe you learned some of this on your own, JavaScript and HTML are usually what we use when we're developing websites. And so what JSX does is essentially combine them. And so traditionally you'd have a JavaScript file, and then you also have an HTML file. But for all intents and purposes, for what we're writing, you're going to see a combined version. And so this is kind of what it looks like. You have some JavaScript up here, and then you have some HTML tags down here. All right, so imports are also another thing that we're going to need to know. This is not a React feature, it is a JavaScript feature, and so imports let you modularize your code, and that just means you can write bits and pieces of code in another file, like an object or a function, and import them into the file that needs to see them or use them. And specifically for React, in order to be able to use React, you need to import React from React. This should be at the top of all your React files, and React DOM only needs to be put in the file that is essentially just going to be putting your code onto the DOM, which is the document object model. It's a pretty important concept to know in web development. I'm not going to go over it in this lecture, but definitely look it up. So React components and props. And so what we're going to be going over is kind of the selling point of React, which is components. And this picture is just there to illustrate that uh, everything that you kind of see can be turned into a component. So for Facebook post, it's created out of a button image, a couple of paragraphs, and also, yeah, so everything else is essentially the same. And when you put them together, you can create a component that can be reused. So, all Facebook posts have essentially the same kind of layout, but they'll usually have different information. So it's not going to be Dustin Newman on every single post, but you get the idea. And so we're going to go over the two types of components and also props, which are a very important concept in React. So this is a class component, and essentially we define it by saying class welcome. That's the name of your class. Extends React component. So essentially you're making a subclass of the React component, and React.component, excuse me. And then within what we're returning is an h1 tag, hello, and then these little brackets right here are when you use JavaScript and you want to inject it inside of some HTML. So this is an HTML tag, and inside of it we have some text, and then we have our JavaScript. So that's when it is appropriate to be using these brackets. And then so we have this.props.name. And so that might seem pretty confusing, but essentially this is in reference to our class welcome. So if you've taken object-oriented programming, you're trying to reference the props that are essentially being inherited by from the React.component class. And so we refer to welcome as this within itself, and then .props, which are the properties that it has, and we'll go over it more in depth. But for right now, props are essentially the properties that are passed in to welcome, and also .name, right? So when you create an instance of this class, welcome, you can create it with certain properties. And so name is one of them. And you can pass in a name. And when that name is passed in, it's going to get filled in right there. So that's kind of like the basics of props. And then we have our React functional components. So for this one, we have welcome again as the name of the function. And if you continue your JavaScript / React journey sometime in the future, you're going to find out that functions and classes are pretty similar. And so we're essentially representing this code as a function, and we pretty much refactored it to do the same exact thing, just as a function. And so you have the name of the function, so you declare it as a constant, and then you pass in props. So this is a little bit different from a class, because you're actually passing in props as a parameter. And then instead of this, because it's not a class, you can just reference that parameter and do .name. So React render. So with React render, this is kind of the little bit of code that you saw about 2 slides ago. And it's a method of the component class that I was showing you earlier. And so pretty much what you need to know is whatever you want to be returned needs to be within one element essentially. So with this, you could see it's returning one div, and everything else, all the other elements or components that you want to get returned slash rendered, um, need to be nested within this div. So you don't need to use a div. You could actually just make a component that has everything in it and return an instance of that component. Okay, React states. And so React states, this is kind of why we have two different types of components. So we have a class component and then we have a functional component. If they do the same thing, why have them? Well, React states is one of the reasons why we have them. So if you make a component that needs to keep track of something within itself, for example, with this clock, it needs to keep track of the date or the time. And so if you have a component that needs to keep track of anything, you're going to want to make it into a class component so it can keep track of its state. And so let's go over this. So we're going to, once again, create a class. This time it's called clock, and extend, so is a subclass of React.component. And so whenever you're starting to make something that's keeping track of its state, you want to have constructor for this class. And so that constructor is going to inherit the properties or props from React component, and those are going to be necessary for us to be working with, states. And so that's what superprops does. It inherits the properties of the React component class. And this dot state is essentially a container to keep track of things that we want to keep track of. Like I was saying earlier, we're making a clock that wants to keep track of its date. So how it stores that is in an object model that has key value pairs. So we have our key, which is the date, and then the value of that date is going to be this new date right here. And so if we go down, we can see how that state is utilized. Like I said before, this refers to our clock, and then state, it refers to the container that we were mentioning earlier. And then we want to get the date key, and then we want to essentially use a method that date has to get the local time as a string. And so what it will print out when this is rendered will be, it is whatever the local time is. Right. And I will see everyone on the other side of this demo. Thank you. Hi, so welcome to the coding portion of this lecture. And so in order to follow along, you're probably going to need these starter code files. And so you can do that by navigating to this repository, and then it's going to be in week 2, and then you can do starter code right there. And so to get these files, you're going to want to click on this, and then if you know your way around Git, you can of course clone the repo, and then if you don't, you can just simply download the zip. And once again, week 2, and then start code. Alrighty, so let's move to this side of the screen. And so once you have those, you should have your public folder and then your source folder. And to get the node modules, you're just simply going to do npm. While that's going, I'm going to go over the source folder for a little bit. So we have our components for our components, and then we have our lib for Firebase functionality, and then we have app.css, and then app.js. And so a word about the Firebase functionality, it's not needed, and it's a little bit outside the scope of this lesson. So yeah, you can just feel free to stick around if you want to attach a serverless backend to this project. And then we have our app. So we're going to take a look at this file. Oh, this is kept from the last thing. So what we're going to do is look at the top and kind of go over concepts that may have been a little bit blurry for you if you're not a conceptual person, you're more of a hands-on person. So we have our import that we need in order to use React stuff. And then we have our app.css so that we can style this page. You can ignore this function for right now. And we have our first component here, which is a class component called app. And this is going to contain the bulk of our work. And I have some commented out code right now that's going to be for Firebase. So again, you can stick around if you want to learn how to use that. And so we have a couple of empty methods as well. And so yeah, and you might be wondering why we don't have import React DOM. And the reason is, I'll open this index.js file. It's because this is going to be the script that's going to be rendering our components and our page to the DOM. So you can see that it's following our one element rule. So it's returning one element and it's putting that on the DOM. And so that's going to take care of that for us. For right now, we just need to worry about our app component. And so where we're going to want to start is by creating the basic layout of our application. So we're going to start by creating a div called app container. Nice. And so now that we have our div, I'm going to go over two things real quick. If you've dabbled in HTML, you could probably notice that it's class name instead of class. Traditionally, for CSS class names, you use class, but since we're using JSX, class is a keyword taken by JavaScript. So we're using class name instead. And then we have app container. And so you open up the app.css file, you can see that I already did the CSS and styling part. So you're going to want to follow my naming guidelines so that you could see the styling. All right, cool. Now we can move on. And so now we're going to want to add another thing called a header. We're going to call this header text. And in here, you can put the name of what you want to call your app. It can be anything. I'm going to call it Let's Parlay. And parlay is like French for talk. To talk or to speak. So let's talk. And then down here, we're going to add a paragraph tag. And in here, we can just say, add a caption for what our app is going to be about. So chat and stay a while. Exclamation point. And so now we have some text. And if we type in npm start, just start a local host for us. All right, so this error is a good opportunity for me to show you a cool feature that this project has. And so it has a capability called hot reloading. So essentially when you save your file, because that's what I forgot to do, is save my file. And we forgot to add a very important part of this project. So whenever you want to render something inside of a class component, you're gonna wanna return the elements that you want to render. So cut that and then paste it inside of here. And we'll fix some of this and then save. All right, now it should work. So what did I do? So I essentially returned whatever is in between these parentheses. and we have our one element and then the rest of our elements nested inside that one div. And now we have our stuff on the DOM. And so let's parlay, chat, and stay a while. Cool. And just to show off that hot reloading a little bit more, I can say chat and stay at a minute. Save it on here, and it should update on my browser. Cool. So now let's work on filling out the rest of our structure. And so what we can do is create another div called message box. Oops, class name, message box. And then inside of this div, we can create some inputs. So just somewhere that they can type their messages. So we'll call this text input for styling purposes, text input. And then we can do type. So the type is going to be text. And then finally the placeholder to let them know what to type there is your name. And this is a self-closing tag, so awesome. So now that we have that, we're actually going to copy that and then paste it again. And instead of your name, we can say your message. Awesome. So right now we just made two inputs, so two input boxes where they can type some text. And finally, let's also add a button. So button class name, we'll call it send button. Awesome. And we'll do send message as the text that we want inside of the button. And so if we save this all, it should reload. And now we have two boxes that we can type in, and then also a button that these currently don't do anything, but type in them for fun. And that's pretty neat. All right, so we're gonna get into more React-y stuff, so with components. And so what you're gonna wanna do, since I already added the message.css file, we can do message.js. And so now we have a new file for our new component called message. And so what we're gonna wanna do is, of course, import React from React. And then we want to import /message.css for styling purposes. And so now we can use React inside of this file, and also we can use messages for styling. So an important distinction that I'm going to make right here and right now is that we're using a functional component. And why? Well, later on we're going to talk about states, and when you have a stateless component, so a component that doesn't need to keep track of itself or like any internal things that it needs to know about itself, you can essentially create it as a function instead of a class. And so we're going to do that. So we're going to call it a constant called message, and it's going to take in a parameter called props. We won't have to worry about that quite yet, but it's just important to have that. So we'll open it up and then do return, because of course that's very important. And everything in between those, we're going to return. All right. Awesome. So, whoops. So what I wanted to do was start by kind of talking about the structure of our message. So we want it to look a little bit like a tweet to start off. So just a little box with a profile picture and the name of the person, the date that they are sending it, and then their message, of course. And so we're going to do let image equal, and then there's a really cool website that I want to show you. Awesome. So it's called Adorable Avatars, and essentially it lets you pick an identifier. So let's say Sam, and it gives me a funny little photo. Go back to me, Jacob, and I get this. So essentially it's just changing the URL, and then the identifier gives us a different PNG every time we have a different URL. And so yeah, so right now let's just do this. Oh, the button doesn't seem to be working, so I guess I gotta copy it the old-fashioned way. And then we'll put that inside of string. Cool. So what we're gonna wanna do now is return our element. So our outermost element is gonna be a div called, and inside of that, we're gonna wanna create another div called message item. Cool. And inside of this message item, we want an image tag. We're gonna call this message image img. So message img. Cool. So quick note about this. So traditionally, when you are creating an image tag, you have the source, right? So this is usually linking it to a photo or an image file so that it can display the image. So what we're doing here with these identifiers is essentially we're telling the computer that we're going to be writing JavaScript inside of this HTML. So whenever you are writing or referencing JavaScript inside of your HTML tags, you're going to want to make sure you're making it clear. And so we say not image, but image. And so we're referencing this variable image and inside of this image tag. And so, yeah, just a good thing to note. And then for accessibility purposes, we're going to give it an alt and then files pick. Awesome, it's self-closing. And yeah, so now we have an image inside of here. So that image is going to be this little avatar. And so what we can do is back to here for right now. And all right, now we can start filling out the rest of this message item. So what we're going to want to do next is create another div with the same name, so message item. Message item. Alrighty. Cool. And so for this one, we're going to want to do our text, right? So for this, we're going to want a bold tag inside of the paragraph tags. And we're going to do at Jacob, and then space, and we're going to do some spans. And so in here is going to be today's date, so 09/24/20. Awesome. So this should display that, and then right under it we want, whoops, another paragraph. And for this paragraph, we're going to do our message. So excited to learn React. Cool. So now that we have this, we kind of have our skeleton for our little component. So we want it to have an image, the author's name, and then the date, and then their message, right? So now that we have this skeleton, we can actually use this outside of this file by exporting it. So export default message. So we can save that. And now we can actually use it in our app. So right under the div of message box, so that would be right outside here. So right there, we want to actually make an instance of our message. So message, and you can do it with a self-closing tag or a pair of tags. Either one works. And let's save it. And so there it is. That's our message. And so now you can see that we kind of hard coded our message, and we don't really want that, but we just were building out the skeleton of what it should look like once it has all the information. So next we're actually going to start working on, customizing and passing down props. So like I was saying before, props are pretty important so that we can individualize each message. And so instead of hard coding all this stuff, we can actually start to have our properties take care of that. So with props, they're kind of an expectation of what this component should receive in order to fill out some of these fields. So if we go back, it doesn't have any properties being passed in it to right now. It's just plain. And so we're going to plan for that even though there's nothing being passed in. So what we can do is, since we want our little avatar to be based on a certain identifier, so whether that be some random string of words or someone's name, like Bob, we want that to change based on whatever the user's name is, right? And so what we can do here, back at our image string, is actually concatenate a custom string based on what the user passes in. So for this, we can do props, so referring to our parameter props. So we're expecting props to pass in the author's name. So we can say access that saying props.author. And so essentially what we're saying here is, and I don't actually need to do the curly braces since this is actually just already JavaScript. So that's a little bit redundant. So we can just say props.author is going to get concatenated with these strings to create a custom profile pic. And so in the image tag, it's going to receive that custom string. So for our name, what we actually want to pass in here is we're expecting, let me put a space so it doesn't, okay. So what we want to pass into here is props.author as well. So we're expecting the author's name to be passed in. And here we expecting a timestamp, right? So we can say props.timestamp, timestamp. Cool. And then here we're going to expect a message, a custom message. So we can just say props dot message. Awesome. And if I would save this, this would actually go blank because we're not passing in any properties right now. We would only have, I would expect, just a profile picture if I save this, just because a blank string is still like valid for this URL to provide something. So yeah. So what we're going to want to do next is actually kind of show what it would look like if it got passed in properties. So we can just do something like this. So we can say author is equal to Jacob. We can say message is equal to learning React. And then finally we can do the timestamp as 09 24 20. Right, so cool. So now this is still hard coding, but our expectation is we should, at any time we instantiate or create a instance of our message component, we essentially expect three things. We expect a name, we expect a message, and we expect a timestamp. So we can do this, save it, and we should get something like this, right? And so what we want to do next is create a way in which we can generate messages with custom authors, messages, and timestamps based on the input. So what we want to do in order to do that, and in order to generate more than one message, is actually have a place to store it and keep track of how many messages and what messages we have. And in order to do that, we're going to want to actually keep track of a state. And so if we scroll up here, we actually want to start playing around with states, and that's the reason why this is a class component, because we're going to start keeping track of stuff. And so with state, we're actually going to do something called constructor, pass in props. So it's going to take props from React component, and inside these open braces, we're going to do super props. So inherit those props. And then we say this, so referring to app. If you remember, this always refers to the object it's inside. So that's what we're referring to. So state is equal to an empty object, right? So in JS, this is an empty object, and that is how a state is stored. So it's an object with key value pairs, and that essentially is a container that lets us keep track of things. And so what we want to keep track of are our messages. So we're going to create a message key. And once we access that message key, we want to be able to access an array, right? So right now we're going to keep that array empty, and we're actually going to start to create another, we're going to actually create another method. And so we're going to call that method, I'm going to write it down here, render messages. You see, so we want this to be messages, actually, this array, just because we're going to have more than one message. So yeah, back to down here. So we have render messages. All right. So what we're going to want to do is plan ahead a little bit. So say we have our messages stored in that state. What we want our program to be able to do is essentially iterate through all of our messages and then render them to the screen. So in order to do that, let's start off with the base case, actually. So what if we have no messages, right? So we have no messages, we have our state. So this dot state, so referring to the state of app. So if this dot state, then the messages inside that state is the key that we're referring to. And then we can use the length of that array. And if it's equal to 0, right? We can essentially just return div. For styling purposes, we'll give it the class name of messages container. So messages container, and then we'll say something like it's empty. Chat away. Chat away. Something like this, right? So we want to return an element that tells the user, hey, the chat's empty, start chatting. And so that's our base case, right? And so once we get that out of the way, we want to start creating functionality for our app to be able to go through that state and start popping out messages, right? So let's start with let messages. And the way that you'll be seeing it right here is kind of for clarity. And so we're going to create an empty array called messages. And that's going to be accessed this way. So state, this dot state again, messages. So let's access the messages in our state. And if you've gone over last week, you'll know that this is a higher order function. So for each takes in another function, and our anonymous function is going to take in the parameters of element and I. And then essentially, we're going to do that. All right, so for each is going to go through each of our messages and essentially just basically what we're going to try to do is create a component. And so what we want to do is actually just create some instances of message and then store them inside of messages, right? So how we do that is we're going to just do messages dot push. Messages dot push. So we're going to push inside of that array instance of message, right? And so when you create a new message, you need a specific prop that's important for message generation. So when you create a message with, say, this function for each right here, it's going to need an ID or a key in this case, actually. And that can be I. So this is going to iterate. So for each element, it's going to iterate and it's going to have a specialized key. So it's probably going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way to the length of our messages array in the state. And then we want to give it the property of author, and that's going to belong to element dot author. So it's going to go through the object that we want to store, and message is equal to element dot message. And then finally we have our timestamp as well, which is equal to element dot timestamp. Cool. And so basically what we're doing here is for each message that is going to be in our state, it's empty right now, but imagine we have a couple of objects stored in this array. We're going to take those objects and convert them into properties of a newly generated message component. And so that's how we're going to individualize each of these message components. It's going to have a special key based on the index, and then based on the element we're currently on, it's going to extract an author, a message, and a timestamp. Alrighty. And so after we do that, we're going to want to actually just return. Yeah, okay. So we're going to just want to return in between here a div, oops, that's caps lock, called message container. And inside of this message container, we're going to put messages, right? So messages is this array, right? And so it's going to return an array of messages, right? And so what should be rendered is every single message in that array. That's essentially what we wanted. And so if we come down here to our message, instead of hard coding that message, we can actually just refer to the whole array that we wanted to print out. So we can do, remember, since this is in between some HTML tags, we're actually going to put these identifiers to kind of state that we're using JavaScript with this dot render messages. Nice. It's empty, chat away. And that's expected, right? Because our array is empty, so there's nothing to put, but it shows that it works, right? So it's empty, so they need to chat away in order to start adding stuff, right? And so now what we're going to do is just show a proof of concept. And so to show you that it would work with some messages, again, we're going to hard code some stuff, but eventually we would expect this to self-populate when we get our button and message boxes working. But for right now, let's just say I have an object that has author, an author, a message, and a timestamp. So for the author, we'll put that I'm the author. And for the message, I love React. And then for the timestamp, let's just say, okay, today's date, 20. All right, then we'll create another one of these. So I'll just copy my object. Instead, I'll just say Sam, go code sprint, and the same date. And now you can see if this message array was populated, which it should be once we get those things up and running, it should create some messages, and that array of messages due to our render messages method should start rendering them onto the screen. Alrighty, awesome. So essentially what we're going to want to do next is actually get these things to start working and start self-populating, right? And so let me go up here and delete these things. So we have an empty message array, so we know that it's working. Yeah, so we're gonna want our text boxes to respond to input, right? So I'm gonna do it right with the constructor. So if you remember, we have our two inputs right here. They currently don't do anything. That you can just type text and that's it. We don't want that. We want them to actually handle text input. So handle name change is going to be the method we're using, and it's going to take in an event object, right? So when that event happens, we're going to set the state. So how setting states works, so how do you update the state, right? So we actually use a method called setState. And so when we want to set the state, all we need to do is pass in an object, right? So it's very similar to this object. And so when we pass in that object, we can pass in author, right? Since this is the name chat. And so we want to pass in whatever they typed into there. So e.target.value. And so
what did I do here? So essentially, I'm passing an object with an author and the target value, which is essentially just targeting the value of this text box right here, right? And so when you pass that in, it's actually not going to overwrite this object, but if author doesn't already exist, it's going to add that to the object. Whoops, right? So essentially what you need to know is whenever the name is changed, it's going to set the state upon whatever our trigger is, and it's going to be send message, just as a little spoiler. And so we have to do this for the message as well. So what you can do is just pretty much just copy that. And instead of name change, we're going to do message change because this is for the message box. So message. And for this, instead of an author key, we want a message key. Message key, right? And so now that we have that, we can actually start using those event handlers to do something. So let's see. So here are our text inputs. And so we're going to actually do a couple things. So first of all, we're going to get rid of, you know what, we'll keep it. We'll say value is equal to, yeah, well, since placeholders shouldn't even be there anyways, since we know what we need to type in there. So we can just say for the value, it's going to be equal to whatever the state is telling it to do, be. So its value is going to be the author, and it's going to change. So on change, so whenever that text box changes, essentially it's going to handle that by changing the state itself. So then the value is going to be whatever it was changed to. So handle author change, right? So yeah, you can literally do that for this. I'm just gonna copy it and delete this. Instead of author, I'm going to do message. Instead of author here, the message change. So again, the same kind of cyclical kind of thing. So its value is going to be whatever the state tells it it's going to be, but whatever we're typing in is actually going to update that state. So they're going to be in sync. And that's what we want. So yeah. And then what we want to do is actually work on another method called create message, right? So this create message is essentially going to create and populate our messages for us. And so what we're going to want to do is let new message equal. So a new message should contain what? An author, a message, and then also a timestamp. Right? And so what should author be? Well, it should be whatever the state is telling it, right? So our state is going to tell the author to have that as its value, right? And then same thing for message. So this dot state dot message is going to have that as the value for our message in this object that we created. And the timestamp, okay. So now is when we actually are going to use this. So this function is basically a way for us to get the current time as a string, right? And so what we can do
to utilize it is we can just say new date object. So this class can essentially get the time. All right, and so now the timestamp is going to give us the current time, which is awesome. All right, so what we're going to do next is actually change the state based on what we just created, right? So now that we have our new message, we're actually going to update the state, which is populating it. So let new messages equal this dot state dot messages, and so then we want to push each of the new messages inside of our state. So new messages is in reference to the array that is in our state. So we say new messages dot push new message, right? So now we're pushing each of these newly created message objects into the state, and we're going to be updating it in the very next line. So once that new messages has everything it needs, we can essentially say this dot set state, right? And say messages is now equal to new messages. So that empty array that we had before, or maybe I added a couple of message objects in there already, now it has the new message objects because we just updated it. So new messages. Cool. So now that we have this functionality, you're like, okay, so where would we want to create a message and then store it in the state? Well, I would say that would go in the button functionality, right? So right here, we can say, and on the event of clicking the button, we can set its action to be create message, right? And so now this should handle creating a new message, and that's pretty awesome. And so finally, let's address the timestamp because where is it? Changes, messages, create message. Okay, so right, so the timestamp. So here, actually, that would work. What we do need to change is, since we're actually using the get time function here, we want to change it where messages are being created. So let's go back to render message, which is down here, right? So we had this as a placeholder, right? So instead of expecting just element.timestamp, because we really want the get time string, which is the function we had up there, and inside of its parameters, we want to give it element.timestamp. So this is actually going to turn that timestamp into get time string, and yeah, that should be how it works. Let's see. All right, now we're almost done. Now we have to add one more thing that we've been referencing this whole time. So before we were referencing inside of the
the messages container, which was an empty array. And so with creating a new message from the state of author and the state of message, we actually wanted to add those elements of the state. So what is the current author? So the current author would be whatever is in the text box. And then also um, do an empty string right now. And then we can also do message. So what is the current message in the second message box? Well, we want it to be an empty string as well. Right. Point. So currently I cannot type in here because it's not changing the correct messages, and I apologize for the terrible name conventions. I know message and messages can get quite confusing. And so, where is it? So right here, it says the value, whatever the value should be a cycle, right? So we're referring to messages, which is our array. So what we wanted to actually do is have it be equal to just message, right? So I already deleted it, but our object should have an author, a message, and also a timestamp. And so what we wanted to do is edit the message and in the state, and on the change reflect that. So right, so whenever we edit this box, the value should be reflected in here, right? So now that we have messages instead of message, okay, now we should be able to type in here. Awesome. Right. And so another bug fix that we could probably take care of is something very simple. So we actually call this name change. Whoops. So name change, handle name change. So what we should get is Jacob, I love to learn React. And there we go. Sam as well, maybe. Awesome. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the first part. Alrighty, so for the second part, setting up a Firebase account. Right, so let's go to Firebase. I meant to go to the website, so click Get Started. And so what you're going to want to do is create a project. So you can see a couple of Firebase projects I have. So we'll call this tutorial chat. Continue. We can turn off analytics for right now. And while that's loading, we're actually going to want to open up our Firebase .js file in the library. All right, cool. And so when you're on this page, you're going to want to click on web, name it whatever you want. You can call it my app as a nickname. Yeah, so you can register the app. And so what you're going to want to do is essentially copy this part. Copy that part of your configuration, and you can paste it in here. That should be good. Continue to console. Save this here. And then we can create should be able to create Firestore. All right. So we can create a database. Start in test mode. We'll do a central, and let's enable this. Right. And so if you want to be able to use these things, I already have the function set up, so you can start beginning to uncomment them. So that.
delete this, and then, all right. I believe that was it. Cool. So what you're going to want to do is start a collection, and then for collection ID, ideally that can be whatever you want it to be. I believe there's a way to just oh, actually we'll call this messages, and then I'll go on to the document ID, which should be auto-generated. So you have a collection called messages, and you can auto-generate the document ID, and then for your first field, what you want to do is kind of mirror what we've set up, right? So we want to have an author, which is a string. So for me, I'll do Jacob. I'll add another one, which is also string. Love coffee, and add another field, which is a timestamp. Should be stored as a number. So let's just put 0 for right now. Awesome. So now if I save this, I need to do one more thing actually. So let's import Firebase from /library/Firebase. What should happen is, there we go. So that's it for the Firebase part. Thank you for joining me on this React lecture, and I hope you have a great week. There's actually one more thing that I need to announce, and that's for next week. Make sure you either have Xcode or Android Studio installed, and also Expo. Thanks for stopping by.